The emergency klaxons of the Galactic Council chambers hadn't stopped wailing for 3 rotations, which was really starting to get on Ambassador Quill's nerves. Not that nerves were the right word for whatever passed for anxiety in her translucent, jellyfish-like anatomy, but the sentiment remained. "Order! Order!" she bellowed, her voice rippling through the water-filled speaking chamber like an angry tsunami. "We are the governing body of 412 civilized species, not a flock of panic-stricken hatchlings." Council member Zephyr's feathers were practically vibrating with terror as he clutched his datapad with talons that had seen better days. "Civilized species don't get systematically hunted to extinction by shadow demons," he squawked, his bird-like head swiveling frantically between the holographic displays showing the carnage. "Look at this. Fleet 7, gone. Exploration Station Gamma, empty. The mining operation on Kepler 442b, nothing but scorch marks and screaming." Commander Blocks clicked his mandibles in what passed for disagreement among his insectoid people. "Screaming is hardly scientific evidence, Zephyr. Though I admit the data is concerning." Concerning was military speak for absolutely terrifying, but Blocks had a reputation to maintain. The hologram in the center of the chamber flickered to life, showing grainy surveillance footage that had cost them 14 good reconnaissance drones to obtain. What they saw defied classification by every xenobiology database in known space. "The Shadow Ripper," Quill announced unnecessarily, because everyone in the chamber had seen this footage so many times they could probably recreate it in their sleep. If they could still sleep, which most of them couldn't after witnessing this thing in action. The creature moved like liquid death through the corridors of what used to be Research Station Beta 7. 8 feet of pure nightmare fuel, with claws that could shred titanium and reflexes that made professional assassins look like arthritic grandparents. But it wasn't just the physical capabilities that made it terrifying. It was smart. "Observe the tactical awareness," Commander Blux noted, his compound eyes focusing independently on different aspects of the footage. "It disables communications first, then life support, then picks off the crew one by one. This isn't mindless predation. This is systematic elimination." Zephyr's feathers had now achieved what scientists would later classify as maximum fluff, a defensive posture that made him look like an anxious rainbow cotton ball. "We've tried everything, plasma cannons, neurotoxin gas, even hired those mercenary guild psychopaths with their no questions asked policy. Nothing works. It's like this thing is unkillable." "Perhaps," Ambassador Quill mused, her tendrils swishing thoughtfully through her aquatic medium, "we're thinking about this wrong. What if instead of trying to kill it, we capture it, study it, learn from it?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when someone suggests juggling live grenades at a funeral. Perfectly quiet, but loaded with the promise of imminent disaster. "Capture it," Blocks repeated slowly, as if testing the words for any possible hint of sanity. "You want to capture the apex predator that has single-handedly turned 3 sectors of space into a no-fly zone." "Well, when you put it like that," Quill admitted, "it does sound rather ambitious." Before anyone could suggest alternative strategies, like perhaps fleeing to another galaxy, the chamber's communication system crackled to life. The voice that emerged belonged to Junior Analyst Pip, whose job was monitoring deep space reconnaissance feeds and whose voice currently contained enough panic to power a small star. "Council members, emergency priority transmission. The Shadow Ripper situation has... it's developed complications." Commander Blox's antennae twitched. In his experience, complications were just the universe's way of saying, "You thought things were bad before? Hold my space beer." "Define complications, Analyst," he ordered. "Sir, our long-range scanners have detected the Shadow Ripper at coordinates 77 Alpha, but..." Pip's voice cracked like a teenage boy asking someone to prom. "But it's not alone." The main hologram flickered and stabilized, revealing footage that would later be classified as Nightmare Fuel Premium Grade in the Council archives. There, clear as a supernova and twice as disturbing, was the Shadow Ripper. But standing next to it, looking remarkably casual for someone consorting with galactic death incarnate, was something else entirely. "What in the 7 hells of Proxima is that?" Zephyr shrieked, pointing a trembling wing at the bipedal creature that barely reached the Shadow Ripper's shoulder. The thing was pink. Not the healthy pink of a Caraxian coral bloom, or the warning pink of Venusian poison fungi, but a weird, fleshy pink that somehow managed to be both harmless-looking and deeply unsettling. It had only 2 arms, 2 legs, and what appeared to be a disturbing lack of any visible natural weapons. No claws, no fangs, no acid glands, no nothing. "Preliminary scans indicate it's a previously unknown species," Analyst Pip reported, her voice still carrying that delightful tremor of someone who'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy. Bipedal, carbon-based, approximately 6 feet tall, and, oh dear, what? Ambassador Quill demanded, though she was beginning to suspect that oh dear was rapidly becoming the official motto of this entire situation. It appears to be communicating with the Shadow Ripper. The footage showed the pink creature making various gestures with its appendages, while the Shadow Ripper's head tilted in what could charitably be described as a listening posture. Then, impossibly, the nightmare predator that had terrorized 3 sectors did something that made every council member question their grip on reality. It nodded. Commander Block's compound eyes were performing what entomologists would later classify as the full panic swivel. "Are you telling me," he said slowly, "that this creature has domesticated the Shadow Ripper?" Domesticated might be too strong a word, Quill mused, though her tendrils were coiling and uncoiling in patterns that suggested she was having serious second thoughts about her chosen career path. Perhaps it's more of a partnership? Zephyr had progressed beyond maximum fluff into what researchers would eventually term critical fluff, a state where his feathers had achieved such volume that he resembled a very anxious peacock that had been struck by lightning. Partnership. It's formed an alliance with the most dangerous predator in known space. What's next? Are they going to start a book club? The footage continued, showing the unlikely pair moving through what appeared to be the cargo hold of a derelict freighter. The pink creature was examining various pieces of equipment, while the Shadow Ripper stood guard, its head constantly swiveling to check for threats. It was almost protective. "Run bioscans on the unknown species," Commander Blocks ordered. "I want to know everything about this thing, what it eats, how it breeds, and most importantly, how it managed to turn our apex predator problem into an apex predator with a sidekick problem." The results, when they came back, did nothing to improve anyone's mood. "Sir," Pip's voice had now achieved a pitch that was causing the water in Quill's chamber to vibrate sympathetically. "The bioscans are unusual. This creature appears to have no natural weapons, limited physical capabilities, and a skeletal structure that suggests it evolved on a world with relatively low gravity. By all known parameters of predator psychology, it should be prey." "Should be prey," Zephyr repeated, his voice hollow with the kind of existential dread usually reserved for philosophers and tax accountants. "Instead, it's apparently the Shadow Ripper's best friend." Ambassador Quill's tendrils had gone completely still, which among her species was equivalent to a human holding their breath. What kind of species, she wondered aloud, can befriend something that considers our battleships to be light snacks? Unknown to the panicking council, approximately 7 light-years away, Jake Morrison was having a perfectly normal conversation with his salvage partner. "Hey Rays, you think this hyperdrive core is worth anything? Looks pretty beat up, but the quantum matrix seems intact." Razes, who the galactic community had dubbed the Shadow Ripper but who preferred his actual name, examined the component with the careful attention of someone who'd learned the hard way that rushing through salvage operations was a good way to get blown up. His species might look terrifying to most of the galaxy, but they were actually quite methodical about technical work. "Functional," Rays rumbled in the deep, harmonic language of his people, which Jake had learned over the past 6 months of partnership. "Third-generation Altarian design. Market value, approximately 4,000 credits. Sweet," Jake grinned, completely unaware that this casual conversation was being monitored by approximately half the galactic intelligence community. "That should cover fuel and supplies for the next month. Want to grab some lunch after we finish here?" Raze's equivalent of a smile involved a slight softening around the edges of his rather impressive dental arrangement. "Affirmative. Your species' nutritional preparations have proven surprisingly adequate." If the Galactic Council could have heard this exchange, they probably would have interpreted it as a terrifying predator reporting to its master about hunting success and planning their next attack. Instead, it was just 2 friends discussing whether to have sandwiches or leftover pizza. 3 days after the Council's collective nervous breakdown, Commander Blocks was staring at tactical displays that made less sense than a philosophy textbook written in interpretive dance. His best strategists had been working around the clock to predict the Shadow Ripper and its mysterious companion's next move, and they'd come up with exactly nothing useful. "Sir," reported Captain Vex, a spider-like officer whose multiple eyes were particularly good at spotting patterns. "We've analyzed their movement trajectory and it appears they're heading for the Kepler Nebula." "The abandoned shipping lanes," Blocks mused, clicking his mandibles thoughtfully. "Perfect hunting ground. Isolated, plenty of derelict vessels to use as lairs, minimal council patrol presence." What Commander Blocks didn't know was that Jake had specifically chosen that route because it was quiet, had good salvage opportunities, and most importantly, nobody bothered you about permits when you were technically in unclaimed space. It was the intergalactic equivalent of taking back roads to avoid traffic. "Deploy the 7th Fleet to intercept," Blocks ordered. "Full battle configuration. If we can't kill this thing, maybe we can at least contain it and its handler." Meanwhile, Jake was having the kind of day that would later be studied in xenopsychology courses as a case study in species-wide misunderstanding. He just pulled their salvage ship, the Rusty Bucket, up to what looked like a perfectly ordinary derelict cargo hauler. "Rays, you getting any life signs from this thing?" Jake called out, running his scanner over the hull. "Looks like it's got some decent tech, but I want to make sure we're not interrupting someone's nap." Rays performed his usual thorough scan, because his species had learned that rushing into unknown spaces was an excellent way to become very dead very quickly. "Negative life signs, however, detecting unusual energy signatures. Recommend caution." "Caution is my middle name," Jake lied cheerfully, because his middle name was actually Eugene, and because caution had never stopped him from investigating anything shiny. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? In the grand tradition of famous last words throughout the galaxy, this question was immediately answered when Jake's cutting torch triggered what turned out to be a very sophisticated sensor array hidden in the derelict's hull. Lights began flashing, alarms started wailing, and somewhere in the distance, automated systems began broadcasting their location to every military frequency in the sector. Jake observed with the kind of calm that comes from years of accidentally triggering things that probably shouldn't be triggered. That's new. The derelict ship, as it turned out, wasn't actually derelict. It was what the military called a honey trap, a fake abandoned vessel loaded with sensors and remote weapons, designed to catch unwary pirates and smugglers. The Council had deployed dozens of them after the Shadow Ripper incidents, hoping to gather intelligence on their mysterious predator. Instead, they'd caught Jake Morrison, who was currently trying to figure out why his salvage find was having what appeared to be an electronic seizure. "Rays, you ever see anything like this before?" Jake asked, poking at a control panel that was flashing more colors than a disco ball having an identity crisis. Ray's response was cut short by the arrival of approximately 30 heavily armed drones, each about the size of a small fighter and bristling with enough weaponry to level a small moon. They emerged from concealed compartments throughout the fake derelict like the world's most dangerous surprise party. "Ho-ho," Jake said, with the kind of understatement that would later be quoted in military textbooks. "That's probably not good." What happened next would be analyzed by tactical experts for decades. Jake, thinking he was dealing with some kind of automated security system, immediately started trying to shut down what he assumed were malfunctioning defense drones. His approach was methodical, practical, and completely logical from a salvage operator's perspective. He began systematically disabling the drones by targeting their power cores with precisely applied plasma bursts from his cutting torch. From the Council's perspective, watching through their remote sensors, they were witnessing the pink creature commanding its predator companion in a devastating combat display. Every move Jake made was interpreted as tactical genius. Every successful drone disabling was seen as evidence of his species' terrifying combat capabilities. "Look at the coordination," gasped Analyst Pip, watching the feed with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. "The creature barely gestures, and the Shadow Ripper knows exactly which targets to prioritize." What they were actually seeing was Jake saying things like, "Hey, Rays, can you get that one on the left? I can't reach it from here." And Rays responding with the helpful efficiency of someone who'd spent months learning to work alongside his human partner. The situation escalated further when Jake, frustrated by the continuing alarm systems, decided to trace the problem to its source. Using skills learned from years of jury-rigging broken salvage equipment, he began following power conduits and data cables with the dogged determination of a human who just wanted the blinking lights to stop. To the monitoring Council forces, this looked like a systematic infiltration of their most sophisticated intelligence-gathering operation. The pink creature was methodically dismantling their defenses, while its predator companion provided overwatch. "It's learning our technology," Zephyr squawked, his feathers now approaching what scientists would classify as theoretical maximum fluff. "First it domesticates an apex predator, now it's reverse engineering our military hardware." Commander Blocks watched in fascination and horror as Jake traced the main power coupling to what was obviously the trap's central computer core. Tactical assessment. Hostile is attempting to access our classified databases. Jake, meanwhile, had found what he thought was the source of the malfunction. "There we go," he muttered, applying his plasma cutter to what looked like a completely fried circuit board. "Some people really need to learn basic electrical maintenance." The moment his torch severed the main data link, every monitoring station in the sector went dark. From the Council's perspective, The enemy had just blinded them with surgical precision. Jake looked around at the now quiet ship and nodded with satisfaction. That's better. Rays, want to grab some of these power cells before we head out? They look like they're in decent shape. Affirmative, Rays replied, beginning to carefully extract salvageable components with the methodical care of his species. Suggest rapid departure. Energy signatures indicate incoming vessels. Good point, Jake agreed. Because incoming vessels in salvage territory usually meant either pirates or customs officials, and he wasn't really in the mood to deal with either. Let's pack up and find somewhere quieter. As the rusty bucket departed the scene, it left behind a completely disabled intelligence station, 30 destroyed military drones, and a council fleet that was beginning to realize they weren't dealing with an ordinary threat. Status report, Commander Blocks demanded, as his ships arrived at the coordinates where their trap used to be. Sir, Captain Vex reported, her multiple eyes blinking in patterns that suggested she was having trouble processing what she was seeing. The honey trap has been completely neutralized, all drones destroyed, all monitoring systems disabled, and the central computer core has been surgically removed. Surgically removed? Yes, sir. Someone cut out exactly the components they needed and left everything else intact. It's almost professional. Commander Blocks stared at the tactical display, feeling the kind of dread usually reserved for people who just realized they'd brought a knife to a thermonuclear war. Get me a direct line to the council chambers. We need to escalate this to Code Red. Somewhere in the distance, Jake was examining a perfectly good computer core and wondering why someone had thrown it away. Hey Rays, think this thing's got any good processing power? Might be worth upgrading our navigation system. Probability high, Rays agreed. Your species demonstrates remarkable efficiency in resource utilization. It was, Jake reflected, shaping up to be a pretty good day. The Galactic Council's 7th Fleet had Jake and Rays surrounded before they'd even finished installing their newly acquired navigation upgrade. 12 battleships, 47 destroyers, and enough firepower to glass a small planet had formed what Commander Blocks proudly called an impenetrable tactical formation. Jake looked out the viewport of the rusty bucket at the impressive light show of military vessels and had exactly the reaction you'd expect from someone who'd spent most of his adult life accidentally wandering into situations he wasn't supposed to be in. Well, crap, he observed. Rays, you think we forgot to renew our salvage permits again? Raze, whose species had developed a healthy respect for overwhelming displays of force during their rather violent evolutionary history, was considerably more concerned. Negative. Permit status current. Recommend immediate defensive posture. Defensive? Come on, they're probably just space cops. I bet if we explain about the salvage rights and show them our documentation, this whole thing will blow over. Jake activated his communication system with the breezy confidence of someone who talked his way out of dozens of similar situations. This is Jake Morrison, aboard the salvage vessel Rusty Bucket. Is there some kind of problem, officers? The response came from Commander Blocks himself, speaking through what the military called a full intimidation protocol transmission. Maximum volume, enhanced harmonics, and enough bass frequencies to rattle teeth in species that had them. Hostile vessel. You are surrounded. Surrender immediately or face total annihilation. Jake winced and turned down the volume. Geez, somebody's having a bad day. Look, if this is about that derelict we just salvaged, I'm pretty sure it was legitimately abandoned. No life signs, no active transponders, totally standard procedure. On the bridge of the flagship, Commander Blocks was experiencing what his species classified as complete tactical bewilderment. The enemy commander's response was either the most sophisticated psychological warfare he'd ever encountered, or the creature was genuinely unaware that it had just destroyed a top-secret military installation. Sir, reported his communications officer, a slug-like being whose expertise in linguistic analysis was legendary throughout the fleet. The hostile speech patterns suggest either complete innocence or sociopathic levels of deception. With respect, Commander, interjected Captain Vex. Given what we've observed of this species' capabilities, I'm leaning towards sociopathic deception. Blocks clicked his mandibles in what passed for agreement. Maintain siege formation. I'm going to attempt direct negotiation. What followed was a masterpiece of cross-pex miscommunication that would later be required reading in diplomatic academies throughout the galaxy. Filed under How Not to Make First Contact. Hostile Commander, Blocks transmitted. We are the enforcement arm of the Galactic Council. You and your Hell companion are wanted for multiple acts of aggression against Council territories. Jake's response was immediate, and from his perspective, perfectly reasonable. Galactic Council? Never heard of you guys. Are you some kind of new trade organization? Because if you're looking to register salvage operators, I've got all my paperwork right here. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when one side of a conversation is offering business licenses while the other side is contemplating orbital bombardment. He's claiming ignorance of the Council, Analyst Pip whispered to Ambassador Quill, who was monitoring the exchange from the safety of her water-filled chamber. Either his species has no concept of galactic governance, or he's so confident in his abilities that he considers the Council irrelevant, Quill finished. Neither possibility is particularly comforting. Commander Blocks decided to try a more direct approach. You have destroyed Council installations and eliminated military personnel. Explain your actions. Eliminated military personnel. Jake's voice carried the kind of genuine confusion that was either perfectly authentic or performed by someone who could have won awards for acting. Look, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I'm just a salvage operator. I find broken stuff, fix it if I can, and sell it to people who need it. I've never eliminated anybody. Reyes, listening to this exchange with growing concern, decided that his human partner might need some assistance in dealing with what was obviously a tense diplomatic situation. In the harmonious, rumbling language of his species, he offered what he considered to be helpful clarification. What the Council heard was the Shadow Ripper communicating directly with the fleet in what their translation systems registered as aggressive, territorial challenge vocalizations, with possible threat implications. What Raze had actually said was roughly equivalent to, "Jake, I think these people might be upset about something. Should I help explain that we're just trying to make an honest living?" The effect on the Council fleet was immediate and dramatic. Several of the smaller ships actually moved backward, their captains apparently convinced that the Shadow Ripper was issuing some kind of ultimatum. "Did it just threaten us?" Captain Vex asked, her multiple eyes focusing on the translation readout with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching natural disasters. "Threat assessment, highly probable," Commander Blocks replied, though privately he was beginning to wonder if this situation had spiraled completely beyond his understanding. "Maintain defensive positions." Jake, meanwhile, had noticed that his friendly attempt at communication seemed to have made things worse. "Okay, clearly there's been some kind of mix-up here. How about I come over to your ship and we sort this out face to face? I find these kinds of situations work better with a handshake and maybe some coffee." The word coffee triggered every biological warfare alert in the Council database. Their translation systems, faced with an unknown substance being offered by a hostile species, classified it as a potential toxin and immediately flagged it as a Class 7 biological threat. "He's offering to deploy chemical weapons," Pip reported, her voice climbing into frequencies that were causing structural vibrations in nearby equipment. "Sir, I think he's proposing to poison our atmosphere, and he wants to board our flagship to do it personally," Captain Vex added. "The tactical implications are disturbing." Commander Blocks was beginning to suspect that this first contact scenario had gone so far off the rails that it was now operating in a completely different dimension of space-time. "Negative, hostile commander. You will remain on your vessel. Any attempt to approach will be considered an act of war." Jake scratched his head, which the Council's behavioral analysts immediately interpreted as a threat display involving the manipulation of cranial appendages. "Look, I'm getting the feeling you folks are really upset about something, but I honestly have no idea what. If you could just tell me what law I'm supposed to have broken, maybe we can work something out." "Law?" Blocks clicked his mandibles in what might have been laughter if the situation weren't so terrifying. "You've systematically destroyed Council installations, eliminated trained military personnel, and formed an alliance with the most dangerous predator in known space. You want to discuss parking violations?" "Parking violations would actually be a step up," Jake muttered. "At least those make sense. Reyes, you getting any of this?" Reyes responded in his own language, attempting to provide what he thought was helpful context about salvage regulations and interspecies commercial law. The Council translation systems registered this as extended tactical briefing, with probable discussion of target prioritization and assault strategies. "They're planning their next attack," Captain Vex reported, with the kind of calm that comes from being so far beyond panic that you achieve a zen-like state of acceptance. "Right in front of us." Ambassador Quill's tendrils had gone completely rigid, which in her species indicated either deep thought or complete system failure. "Commander Blocks, I'm beginning to think we may have made some incorrect assumptions about this situation." "What kind of incorrect assumptions?" "The kind where we assumed we understood what was happening." Jake, growing increasingly frustrated with what appeared to be the most bureaucratic space cops in the galaxy, decided to try one more time. "Okay, look, let me make this really simple. My name is Jake Morrison. This is my business partner Reyes. We find broken spaceships and salvage useful parts from them. We have never attacked anyone, threatened anyone, or eliminated anyone. We just want to make enough money to keep our ship running and maybe afford the occasional decent meal. Is any of this getting through?" The honest simplicity of this statement hit the Council fleet like a physics-defying slap to the face. For a moment, Nobody knew what to say. Then Commander Block's tactical officer reported something that made the situation even more confusing. "Sir, deep scans of the hostile vessel indicate it's actually a salvage ship. Genuine salvage equipment, legitimate cargo holds, and what appears to be a collection of spare parts that match items reported missing from derelict vessels throughout the sector." Jake smiled with the satisfaction of someone whose paperwork was finally being properly reviewed. "See? I told you guys. Everything completely legitimate and above board." "But," Captain Vex interjected, "if they're actually salvage operators, then what about the destroyed installations, the missing military personnel, the Shadow Ripper incidents?" Commander Block stared at his tactical displays, feeling like someone had just told him that the laws of physics were more like guidelines anyway. "I have absolutely no idea." Jake's voice crackled through the comm system one more time. "Hey, if you guys are done checking my credentials, would it be okay if we headed out? We've got a delivery to make on Kepler 7, and the customer gets cranky if we're late." And that was how the Galactic Council's most sophisticated military operation turned into the universe's most awkward traffic stop. What happened next would later be taught in diplomatic academies as the Great Salvage Incident, and used as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper communication protocols. It began when Jake, growing tired of sitting in space, having a circular conversation with increasingly agitated military personnel, decided to take matters into his own hands. "Rays, fire up the Universal Translator. I think these guys might not be getting the full picture here." The Universal Translator was a piece of salvaged Alterian technology that Jake had found 6 months ago and had been meaning to properly calibrate. It was designed to handle real-time linguistic conversion between species, but, like most of Jake's equipment, it worked on what could charitably be called best effort principles. When Jake activated it, the effect on the Council fleet was immediate and profound. Instead of the heavily filtered, military-grade translations they'd been receiving, they suddenly heard Jake's actual voice, complete with the casual tone, slight confusion, and genuine friendliness that characterized most of his conversations. "Testing, testing, okay, is this thing working? Can you guys understand me better now?" Commander Blocks nearly fell off his command perch. The difference was startling. Instead of the cold, calculated tones of a master strategist, they were hearing what sounded suspiciously like a regular person having a regular conversation. "Affirmative," Blocks replied cautiously. "Communication clarity has improved significantly." "Great. Okay, so now maybe we can figure out what's got everyone so worked up. You mentioned something about destroyed installations and missing personnel. When did all this supposedly happen?" Analyst Pip consulted her records with the efficiency of someone who'd been living on stimulants and anxiety for the past several days. "Beginning approximately 7 standard months ago, we began receiving reports of systematic attacks on Council facilities throughout sectors 7 through 12. 7 months ago, Jake mused. "Huh. That's right around when I started working this region. What kinds of attacks are we talking about?" "Complete destruction of research stations, elimination of all personnel, theft of advanced technology," Captain Vex reported. "Always the same pattern. Communications disabled first, then life support, then systematic elimination of witnesses." Jake was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of genuine concern. That's really awful. I'm sorry to hear about your people. But I have to ask, are you sure it was attacks? Because some of the stuff I've salvaged out here, the stations were already abandoned when I found them." "Abandoned?" Ambassador Quill's voice rippled through the communication system with new interest. "Our records indicate those facilities were fully operational." "Well, yeah, but..." Jake paused, apparently thinking through something. "Okay, let me ask you this. When your people abandon a station, do they usually shut down life support and communications before they leave?" The silence that followed was the kind of silence that occurs when everyone suddenly realizes they might have been looking at a situation completely backward. Commander Blocks clicked his mandibles slowly. "Standard evacuation protocols require systematic shutdown of all non-essential systems to prevent environmental hazards and unauthorized access." "Right," Jake said. "And if you're in a hurry, like maybe there's some kind of emergency, you might not have time to send out proper notifications or update your databases, right?" "Theoretically, yes. And if a station's been sitting empty for a few months, all the perishable supplies would be gone, most of the crew's personal stuff would be missing, and you'd mainly just have the basic infrastructure left behind." Captain Vex's multiple eyes were beginning to focus on a very uncomfortable possibility. "Commander, when was the last time we actually verified operational status with any of these facilities?" The answer, as it turned out, was significantly longer than anyone wanted to admit. The Council's communication protocols assumed that facilities would report any status changes, but in the chaos of recent galactic politics, several budget cuts, and what historians would later term bureaucratic incompetence, Many stations had been evacuated without proper notification procedures. So let me get this straight, Jake continued, his voice carrying the kind of patient tone usually reserved for explaining things to small children. You think I've been attacking your people, but it's possible that some of these places were already empty when I got there. Possible, Blocks admitted reluctantly. But that doesn't explain the Shadow Ripper incidents. Multiple witnesses reported being attacked by the creature. This was when Raze decided to contribute to the conversation. With the universal translator now functioning properly, his deep, harmonic voice came through with perfect clarity. Clarification requested. Definition of attack requires context. Defensive responses to perceived threats may appear aggressive to untrained observers. The effect of hearing the Shadow Ripper speak in complete, grammatically correct sentences was roughly equivalent to watching a natural disaster politely introduce itself. You can talk, Ambassador Quill said, her voice carrying the kind of wonder usually reserved for witnessing miracles or watching politicians tell the truth. Affirmative. Communication ability is standard among my species. Previous encounters may have involved translation difficulties or stress-induced defensive behaviors. Jake chuckled. Yeah, Race doesn't really like being shot at, tends to make him cranky, but he's actually pretty mellow once you get to know him. Shot at? Commander Block's antennae twitched. Our reports indicate the Shadow Ripper initiated all hostile encounters. Well, from whose perspective? Jake asked. Because if someone starts firing plasma cannons at you before they bother to say hello, most people are going to assume they're not interested in friendly conversation. What followed was a systematic review of every Shadow Ripper incident on record, with Raze providing his perspective on each encounter. The picture that emerged was deeply embarrassing for everyone involved. Incident 1. Research Station Alpha 7. Council records indicated a savage attack that left no survivors. Raze's account. Approach station requesting emergency medical assistance. Automated defense systems activated. Departed under fire after attempts at communication failed. Incident 2. Mining operation Kepler 442b. Council reports. Complete destruction of facilities and elimination of personnel. Raze's version. Station appeared abandoned. Investigated for salvage opportunities. Security drones began firing without warning. Defended self until withdrawal possible. Incident 3. Fleet 7 engagement. Council records. Unprovoked assault resulting in total fleet loss. Raze's perspective. Multiple vessels surrounded salvage ship. Demanded surrender without explanation. Responded to weapons fire in accordance with survival protocols. The pattern was becoming uncomfortably clear. Every Shadow Ripper attack had been a case of mistaken identity, poor communication, or jumpy military personnel shooting first and asking questions later. So, Jake said after they'd finished reviewing the incidents, it sounds like this whole thing has been one big misunderstanding. Your people thought Raze was attacking them, so they shot at him. He thought they were attacking him, so he defended himself. Nobody bothered to actually try talking to each other, until now. Ambassador Quill's tendrils were performing what marine biologists would later classify as the full mortification spiral. It appears that our first contact protocols may have been inadequate. First contact? Jake's voice carried genuine surprise. Wait, are you telling me that Raze species isn't part of your galactic whatever it is? The Galactic Council represents 412 member species, Commander Blocks explained. The Shadow Ripper's species was not among them. Well, that explains a lot, Jake mused. No wonder there were translation problems. And I'm guessing humans aren't members either? Humans? Yeah, that's what my species is called. We're from a little planet called Earth, way out in the galactic suburbs. Mostly harmless, despite evidence to the contrary. The revelation that they'd been dealing with not one but two previously unknown species hit the Council fleet like a cosmic brick to the collective face. It also raised some uncomfortable questions about their intelligence-gathering capabilities. Sir, Andal Pip reported in a voice that suggested she was having serious thoughts about career changes. Preliminary scans indicate there are approximately 8 billion humans on their homeworld, and an estimated 40 million of Raze's species distributed across 12 star systems. 40 million Shadow Rippers, Captain Vex repeated slowly. And 8 billion humans. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of intimidating, Jake admitted. But really, most of us are pretty busy with our own stuff. I mean, until today, I didn't even know you guys existed. This casual admission that an entire spacefaring civilization had been operating independently in Council space without anyone noticing was the kind of intelligence failure that ended careers and prompted very uncomfortable questions during budget hearings. The situation reached peak absurdity when Raze, apparently feeling that the conversation had become too serious, decided to demonstrate the peaceful intentions of his species by performing what his people called the gesture of harmless intent. This involved extending his rather impressive claws in a specific pattern while making a low, harmonic sound that roughly translated to "I mean you no harm" and wish to share pleasant conversation. To the council observers, watching through their sensors, it looked like the Shadow Ripper was displaying its weapons while emitting what their computers classified as a territorial challenge vocalization. Several of the smaller ships immediately went to red alert. "Raise," Jake said with the patient tone of someone who dealt with this kind of cross-cultural confusion before. "Maybe save the formal greetings for later. I think these folks are still getting used to the idea that you're not actually trying to eat them." "Understood," Raise replied. "Cultural exchange protocols require adjustment for species unfamiliar with proper etiquette." And that was when Ambassador Quill realized that the most dangerous predator in known space had just apologized for not following proper diplomatic protocol. The emergency session of the Galactic Council that followed would later be remembered as either the most important diplomatic breakthrough in galactic history or the most embarrassing intelligence failure ever recorded, depending on who was writing the history books. Ambassador Quill floated in her chamber, addressing the assembled representatives of 412 civilized species, trying to explain how their most sophisticated military operation had turned into an accidental first contact scenario, with not one but two previously unknown spacefaring civilizations. Not seeing life as a hobby, she realized that whatever Saturn was, she had orbited away from it, and so back to Earth. "To summarize," she began, her tendrils moving in patterns that suggested she was still processing the sheer impossibility of the situation, "the Shadow Ripper crisis that has terrorized 3 sectors for the past 7 months was actually a series of unfortunate misunderstandings, involving a salvage operator named Jake Morrison and his business partner, whose actual name is Raise. Council member Zephyr, whose feathers had finally returned to something approaching normal volume, raised a wing. But surely the systematic destruction of our installations indicates some level of hostile intent." "Well," Quill continued, consulting her notes with the air of someone reading from a particularly unbelievable accident report, "it appears that many of those installations had already been evacuated due to budget cuts, territorial disputes, and what our records diplomatically refer to as administrative oversights. Mr. Morrison was simply salvaging equipment from what he reasonably assumed were abandoned facilities." "And the personnel casualties?" demanded General Thrax, a militant representative from the Regellian Confederacy whose species had never met a problem they couldn't solve with superior firepower. "According to our review, there were no actual casualties. What we interpreted as elimination of personnel was actually personnel had already been evacuated, but nobody updated the databases. The few encounters that did involve active stations resulted in our people shooting first and Rays responding defensively. The silence that greeted this explanation was the kind of silence that occurs when an entire governmental body collectively realizes they've been panicking about their own filing mistake." Commander Blocks, who was present via holographic projection and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the galaxy, cleared his throat mechanically. "If I may, Ambassador, the tactical review of the humans' capabilities suggests we may have larger concerns." "Explain." "Well," Blocks began, consulting his tactical analyses with the air of someone delivering particularly bad news, "Mr. Morrison's approach to problem-solving demonstrates some disturbing characteristics. When faced with our honey trap operation, he systematically identified and neutralized every defensive system, extracted exactly the components he needed, and departed without triggering a single alarm that wasn't supposed to be triggered. So he did all of this while thinking he was performing routine maintenance on malfunctioning equipment. His species appears to possess an intuitive understanding of complex technology that our best engineers would need weeks to analyze." Ambassador Quill's tendrils went very still. "Are you suggesting the human was somehow naturally gifted at military technology?" "I'm suggesting," Commander Blocks replied slowly, "that what we considered our most sophisticated defensive installation was what he considered a minor electrical problem that needed fixing." This observation prompted a flurry of concerned chatter among the council members, which was interrupted by Analyst Pip's voice crackling through the communication system. "Council members, we've completed our preliminary cultural assessment of human civilization based on data transmitted by Mr. Morrison, and I think we may need to reconsider our threat assessment protocols." What Pip had discovered through a combination of Jake's casual conversations and some very basic cultural exchange was that humans approached problems with a combination of optimism, stubbornness, and what could only be described as weaponized curiosity that was unlike anything in the Council's extensive xenological databases. "For example," Pip continued, "Mr. Morrison mentioned that his species regularly engages in activities they call extreme sports, which appear to involve deliberately placing themselves in mortal danger for recreational purposes. Dask doesn't sound so unusual, commented Representative Vask, whose aquatic species was known for elaborate territorial displays. Many species engage in competitive risk-taking, yes, but humans do it for fun. Not for mating displays, not for territorial rights, not for resource acquisition. They literally throw themselves off cliffs attached to pieces of fabric because they find it entertaining. The council chamber buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that occurs when people realize they're discussing something that doesn't quite fit into their understanding of how rational beings should behave. Furthermore, Pip continued, their technological development appears to be driven primarily by a desire to see what happens when they combine things that probably shouldn't be combined. Mr. Morrison described something called duct tape, which they apparently use to repair everything from spacecraft to diplomatic relationships. Duct tape? Ambassador Quill inquired. A multi-purpose adhesive material that, according to Mr. Morrison, can fix anything if you use enough of it. Their approach to engineering appears to be, try it and see what happens, which would explain why he was able to reverse engineer our military system so easily. Commander Block's mandibles clicked in what might have been nervous laughter. So you're telling me that the human disabled our most sophisticated defensive installation using the equivalent of maintenance intuition? Essentially, yes, and he did it while carrying on a casual conversation with his partner about lunch plans. The implications of this were beginning to sink in throughout the chamber. If humans could accidentally neutralize Council military technology while thinking about sandwiches, what could they do if they were actually trying? But the real revelation came when Jake himself, apparently unaware that he was addressing the governing body of most of known civilization, offered some friendly advice about improving their security systems. You know, Jake's voice crackled through the communication array with the cheerful tone of someone offering helpful suggestions. If you guys want to avoid this kind of confusion in the future, you might want to put up some signs or something. Maybe like, active military installation do not salvage, or this is not actually abandoned. Would save everyone a lot of trouble. The fact that their most sophisticated intelligence operations could be derailed by better signage was not lost on anyone present. Also, Jake continued, you might want to work on your first contact protocols. I mean, I know Ray's looks kind of intimidating, but he's actually really polite once you get to know him. Most conflicts could probably be avoided with basic communication. Like, instead of shooting first, maybe try, hello, who are you and what are you doing here? Works great in most situations. Representative Clicks, whose insectoid species had built their entire military doctrine around the principle of overwhelming preemptive force, made a sound that might have been choking. He's suggesting we talk to unknown contacts before engaging them militarily? Revolutionary concept, Ambassador Quill observed dryly. Perhaps we should consider it. The conversation that followed would reshape Council policy for generations, not because humans had demonstrated superior firepower or advanced technology, but because they'd accidentally revealed how many of the galaxy's problems could be solved with better communication, clearer signage, and what Jake cheerfully referred to as basic common sense. Council members, Ambassador Quill announced, I believe we need to seriously consider extending membership invitations to both human and races species, not because they pose a threat, but because they apparently possess problem-solving approaches that we lack. You mean they think differently than we do? Asked Councillor Vex. I mean, Quill replied, that they look at our most serious military crisis and see a filing error that could be fixed with better paperwork and some friendly conversation. The final vote to establish formal diplomatic relations passed unanimously, though several representatives noted that they were primarily motivated by curiosity about what other galactic problems might be solved by asking humans to take a look and see if anything seemed obviously broken. Meanwhile, Jake and Raze had finally been cleared to continue their delivery run to Kepler-7. Completely unaware that they just accidentally solved a major diplomatic crisis and fundamentally altered the political structure of known space. Well, that was weird, Jake observed as they departed the still governing council fleet. Nice folks, though. Very thorough about checking permits. Agreed, Reyes replied, settling into his co-pilot seat with the satisfaction of someone whose cultural etiquette had finally been properly appreciated. Perhaps we should consider expanding operations to include diplomatic consultation services. Nah, Jake said, checking their navigation systems and noting with satisfaction that the new computer core was working perfectly. Too complicated. I'll stick with finding broken stuff and fixing it. Much simpler. And as the rusty bucket jumped to hyperspace, carrying its crew toward their next perfectly routine salvage operation, the Galactic Council began the complex process of explaining to 412 member species that their most feared enemy had actually been trying to help them organize their filing system. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor after all.